Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're shortcutting your journey to being well-informed by tackling an incredibly dense foundational document. We are plunging headfirst into a detailed political science analysis, a course blueprint developed with the complex Nigerian context specifically in view that unpacks the often strained, intricate relationship between citizens and the state.
And this isn't just abstract academic theory.
Not at all. It's the legal, philosophical, and historical infrastructure that determines political power, individual liberty, and really the daily reality of governance.
That's absolutely right. Our source material is expansive, covering 5 distinct modules that move from philosophical abstraction to very concrete socio-political dilemmas. Our mission today is laser-focused.
Okay.
To extract the most critical, high-impact concepts and surprising insights from that material, we need to cover everything, from the initial debates about the state's origin of a social contract to the granular, contentious issues like statism, indigeneity, and the assessment of governmental performance.
And that's about basic public goods provision and, maybe most critically, systemic corruption.
Exactly.
We aim for total clarity and deep context, ensuring you grasp not just what these profound theories are, but why they remain utterly vital to modern political life, especially when you're examining post-colonial systems burdened by historical dislocations.
Yeah.
We're going into extensive detail on everything: political obligation, why you should obey the law, the distinction between negative and positive rights, and the ultimate act of principled dissent: civil disobedience.
Right.
If you want to know what truly binds a person to their country, what they are fundamentally entitled to, and what historical and structural flaws constantly threaten to break that social bond, stick with us.
Let's get into it.
Okay, let's unpack this.
So we have to begin by establishing the fundamental political entity we're talking about, the state itself. The source material insists on a crucial definitional difference. It says the state is an organizational abstraction, an abstract entity, and it is significantly larger and more permanent than the political system or the government.
I think this delineation is so essential because in everyday language, we throw around state, government, and political system totally interchangeably.
We do.
So if the state is the abstract blueprint, how do we distinguish it from the political system?
Think of it this way. The state is like the Constitution, the permanent fundamental framework, the enduring legal abstraction.
Okay.
The political system, on the other hand, is the persistent pattern of human relationships, the continuous forces and processes involving control, influence, power, or authority. It's the dynamic activity.
The day-to-day messy stuff.
The day-to-day messy stuff, exactly. It generates demands and support inputs, and it works to resolve the conflicts that arise in society.
So the political system is the living process of politics, the perpetual give and take. And the government is just the current management team running the building based on that blueprint.
Precisely. The state is the mechanism through which formal institutions operate to achieve its purposes. We can only relate to the state through those concrete institutions: the executive, the judiciary, the armed forces, prisons.
Right, the actual tangible parts.
The tangible parts. And the government, then, is the essential organ through which the abstract state executes its moral duty to administer and serve the citizens and to provide for their happiness through social justice.
Now let's define the state through its essential defining characteristics. There are 5 outlined in our material that distinguish it as the ultimate authority in a territory. First up is effective governmental authority.
This is the legal right of the state to make decisions that people must obey, and it has to be effective.
What does that mean exactly?
It means it's backed by the ultimate power, the right to use coercion to enforce laws. Policies, no matter how well-intentioned they are, fundamentally lack effectiveness unless they carry this stamp of ultimate coercive authority.
And this leads directly into the second and maybe the most potent characteristic: sovereignty. This word derives from the Latin superamus, meaning supremacy. Tell us about the 3 key characteristics the source material assigns to sovereignty.
Okay, so sovereignty is defined as the absolute, perpetual power over all persons and things within its given territory. First, we have absoluteness.
Meaning?
The power is legally binding on all inhabitants and associations, with no legal limitations to its powers internally. Second, indivisibility.
It can't be shared.
It cannot be shared or divided by one state with another state.
And the third characteristic, independence of foreign control, this is where the purely academic definition hits the messy reality of the 21st century, isn't it?
It absolutely does. While the principle states that no foreign power should interfere, the sources note that contemporary economic interference profoundly complicates this independence for developing nations.
You mean organizations like the IMF or the World Bank?
Exactly. When those organizations impose structural adjustment packages, these are loan conditions that dictate national policy on everything from currency valuation to public sector employment. The independence of that legally supreme sovereign state is, in practice, severely compromised.
That structural caveat is so important for understanding modern political reality. Okay, moving on. The third feature is permanence.
This was pretty straightforward. Governments, leaders, political systems, they change, often violently. But the sovereignty of the state itself remains forever. It continues without interruption as long as the state exists in its defined territory.
Okay, so feature 4 is the monopoly on the legitimate use of force.
And here, the word legitimate isn't just a modifier. It's the entire foundation of the state's functional power.
So it's not just that they can use force, it's that people believe they have the right to.
Exactly. It's about the people believing that the government structure, procedures, and decisions possess the quality of rightness or moral goodness, that they have the right to make binding rules.
So legitimacy is the moral currency that converts mere influence, say, a powerful lobby group, into true, recognized authority like a piece of binding legislation.
That's a great way to put it. Without that broad public belief in the rightness of the rules, the state is simply relying on raw coercion, which is unsustainable.
Okay, and the final feature.
The final feature, wrapping up the definition of the state, is the existence of society-wide consensus. The state is founded on an underlying agreement, maybe rooted in common nationality or shared history, that sustains the relationship between the influencer and the influenced and naturally restricts power relations.
Now that we've defined what the state is, we have to address the ancient question. How did it begin? Why did men transition from pre-political life, whatever that looked like, to living under these highly organized, coercive political systems?
The sources present 4 primary approaches to the origin of the state. The first, and maybe the simplest, is the divine origin theory.
The divine right of kings.
The divine right of kings. This proposition states that the state was established by God, and rulers are divinely appointed and accountable only to him.
And the primary political implication of this, beyond the theological one, is that obedience to the state becomes both a religious and a civil duty. The source even cites Romans 13.
It does. And its greatest political merit, historically, was creating a sense of ultimate order and unchallengeable obedience to law among the masses, which, regardless of the morality of the ruler, is necessary for stability in early political systems.
Next, we have something completely different, the brutal force explanation.
Right. This theory proposes that the state results purely from the subjugation of the weaker by the stronger, typically achieved through successful warfare, conquest, or consolidation.
And this approach is powerful because it highlights a crucial shift, doesn't it? The sources cite historical examples like the consolidation of neighboring tribes in Scandinavia. The community that resulted from this force was fundamentally different.
Yes, because of its territorial character.
Meaning, you obeyed the ruler not because you were related to him by blood, which defined the tribe, but simply because you were physically located within the defined territory he controlled.
Exactly. That's the foundational shift toward the modern, geographically defined state.
Okay, so the third approach takes a radical departure, Marxism or the class theory.
For Marxists, the state is traced back historically to economic conditions. The mode of production, how goods are made, determines the type of classes and, consequently, all social and political relations.
So the state isn't a neutral arbiter or a divine institution. It is purely an instrument of the ruling class, the economically dominant class, to dominate others, maintain its hegemony, and preserve the existing economic order.
It's a coercive apparatus serving a specific class interest. Its laws are simply the will of the economically powerful.
And finally, the approach that is generally accepted by scholars as the most accurate.
The historical or evolutionary theory. This rejects divine appointment or a single deliberate human contrivance. Instead, it posits that the state is the result of a natural, gradual, and continuous development over millennia.
And what were the catalysts for this slow evolutionary change? What pushed it along?
Well, the sources point to a few key factors. Kinship, which was the first and strongest bond. Religion, which provided a common moral framework. War and conquest, which forced territories to consolidate.
And then I guess just people becoming more self-aware politically.
Exactly. The gradual development of political consciousness, where people realized they needed permanent, complex structures to manage their collective lives and resolve disputes beyond the family unit.
We've moved from defining the state and its origins to analyzing the foundational philosophies that justify its existence and its power over us. But first, let's quickly reiterate what we mean by theory here.
Good idea. A theory is a conceptual tool used to analyze, organize, and synthesize phenomena into interconnected wholes. It's about establishing patterns of determination, the whats, hows, and whys of political order and disorder.
And no set of political theories has been more impactful, even though they're fundamentally unhistorical, than the social contract theory.
Absolutely. This entire approach is premised on the idea of an agreement entered into by man who originally existed in a state of nature with no formal governmental organization. We have three canonical giants here, each one reflecting their turbulent historical context and their conclusions.
Let's start with Thomas Hobbes, writing during the 17th century. His context, the chaos and brutality of the English Civil War, that's the key to understanding his profound inclination toward absolute, unquestionable governmental authority, isn't it?
It is everything. Hobbes' conception of the state of nature is famously grim. He saw man as essentially self-interested, driven purely by appetites and passions. The resulting condition was a war of every man against every man.
Life is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's one of the most famous lines in political philosophy.
And to escape this terrifying condition, the contract required men to relinquish all rights, inconsistent with peace, to a supreme coercive power, the government or the Leviathan. And this is a critical point. The subjects contracted with each other to submit.
But the Leviathan itself was not a party to the contract.
Exactly. That omission is why the consequence is absolute sovereignty. The Leviathan is unbound and cannot be legitimately accused of breaking the contract.
But this leads to the major philosophical critique that the sources highlight.
Yes. How does a selfish, brutal savage suddenly acquire the capacity to keep complex contractual promises and transform into a cooperative saint simply upon entering this agreement?
Right. The psychological leap required for Hobbes' system to stabilize seems way too great for his own depiction of human nature.
It's a massive tension in his work.
That tension between the nature of man and the demands of the contract is what makes Hobbes so compelling and so frightening. Okay, moving on. We meet John Locke. His political environment was radically different. He lived through and justified the English Revolution of 1688, which limited the power of the monarchy.
Right. Locke's goal was to justify limited government, so his state of nature was far less chaotic. For him, man was free and equal, governed by the natural law of reason, the idea that you shouldn't impair another person's life, health, freedom, or possessions.
So not perpetual war, but the source says it was profoundly inconvenient. What were those specific inconveniences he sought to fix?
Three things were missing. Established, known law, everyone was their own interpreter of natural law, known and impartial judges, and the power to enforce decisions. Since everyone was judge, jury, and executioner in their own case, disputes inevitably spiraled out of control.
So his contract aimed only to fix those specific inconveniences.
Exactly. Individuals gave up only the natural right of enforcing the law of reason to the community. They explicitly preserved the paramount natural rights of life, liberty, and property.
So the consequence is that power resides fundamentally with the community, and the government is essentially a trust.
A trust. And if the government acts contrary to that trust, for instance, by attempting to take property without consent or by acting arbitrarily, the trust is broken, and the community has the right to alter or remove that government. This is the very foundation of constitutional limited government.
Finally, we turn to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose concept of popular sovereignty inspired the French Revolution. His philosophical journey is the most complex.
It really is. Rousseau's state of nature was almost utopian. Man was good, sympathetic, free, and equal, living in idyllic innocence.
His fall from grace wasn't natural passion, like Hobbes suggested.
No, it was the unnatural societal structure introduced by private property, which led to jealousy and conflict.
So to escape the corruptions of civil society, Rousseau proposed the most radical contract.
The most radical. Everyone surrenders all rights completely to the community, not to a Leviathan or a separate government. This community, when fully unified, becomes the sovereign.
And this creates that famous paradox, a form of association that protects each person while allowing them to remain as free as before.
It's a paradox. The resulting sovereignty is absolute, but is the absolute sovereignty of the general will of the community, which is always right and always for the common good.
And this is where we encounter that challenging and frequently misused political idea. Anyone refusing to conform to the general will shall be forced to be free.
It's chilling, isn't it?
Yeah.
It suggests individual liberty must be sacrificed for a higher collective political freedom.
It's a dangerous idea in the wrong hands.
Very. However, Rousseau's importance cannot be overstated. By clearly differentiating the state, the sovereign community from the government, the mere administrator, he proved that will, not force, is the foundational basis of the state. He served as the philosophical blueprint for modern democracy.
Rousseau gave us the idea of an absolute community will demanding total submission for the sake of freedom. But not all philosophers saw the state as a benevolent absolute, even a communal one. Let's look at the alternative frameworks, starting with the liberal democratic theory.
This theory is characterized by its veneration of individual interest and its deep suspicion of state power. Liberals see the state as a neutral, coercive force whose minimal role is strictly the protection of individual rights, liberty, and property.
They famously referred to the state not as a necessary good, but as a necessary nuisance.
A necessary nuisance, exactly. Its power should be as minimal and limited as possible.
Which stands in sharp contrast to the Marxist theory, which fundamentally rejects the notion of the state as neutral or minimal.
Completely. Marxists see the state as the product and manifestation of irreconcilable class antagonism.
So they argue the state is nothing more than a coercive apparatus serving the ruling class.
That's right. It maintains existing sociopolitical relations to preserve the hegemony of the dominant class, contrary to the Hegelian position that the state somehow reconciles these antagonistic classes.
And their ultimate conclusion is perhaps the most provocative political statement. They argue the state is not inevitable and will eventually cease to exist.
Right. Once the class division that necessitated its creation is finally eliminated, that's a massive philosophical leap, assuming a functional society can exist without an ultimate coercive authority to manage disputes.
Shifting from these abstract Western foundations to the concrete reality of a post-colonial system, we now apply these frameworks to the Nigerian state. We have to start with the pre-colonial era, which shows profound diversity polities, ethnic groups, languages, all at various levels of state formation.
And yet they all generally focused on the common good.
The sources categorize these pre-colonial systems into three groupings, and what's common is a strain of accountability and shared morality, often religious, underpinning governance.
Exactly. First, we had the centralized states, like the Caliphate in Bornu and Sakwato. Here, legitimacy was based on ruling according to Sharia Islamic lawmaking, the law supreme over the ruler.
So the ruler's authority came from adhering to a pre-existing moral and legal framework.
Yes. Second, other centralized states like the Yoruba and Edo lands operated with constitutional monarchs. These monarchs ruled with the explicit consent of a council, who held institutional power to relieve the monarch of power if they acted contrary to established law and custom.
And the third system?
The diffused authority systems, typified by the Igbo, Ijaw, and Tiv societies. Here, power was non-centralized, with elders making decisions based on consensus and leadership emerging through family institutions like the Omuna.
And importantly, in all three structures, traditional administration ensured justice, peace, accountability, and efficiency.
Qualities the source material notes are often tragically lacking in the modern Nigerian state.
The transition to the modern state began with what the sources term the colonialism, the epochal dislocation. The key event was the 1914 amalgamation of the Northern and Southern Protectorates by Sir Frederick Lugard.
And this union was not a consensus agreement. It was a decision imposed to serve British administrative convenience and economic interest. It dramatically affected the demographic constitution and stability, immediately exacerbating identity differences.
And the colonial administration then leveraged those differences through policies of indirect rule.
They did. This single act brought about a profound dislocation of state-society relations.
How did that structural flaw underpin the character of the state concerning ethnicity, minority issues, and citizenship politics that we see today?
Well, the process of modernization, urbanization, Western education, the new cash economy was unevenly applied. This process transformed the rural tribesman, who was largely unconscious of broader ethnic differences, into the modern urban ethnic man.
And these new urban dwellers were forced into unequal, high-stakes competition for scarce resources.
Exactly. Jobs in the civil service, access to the best schools, political power. Ethnicity became the primary vehicle for political mobilization and securing those resources.
And perhaps the most damaging legacy, tying back to our discussion of the liberal state, is the attitude toward the state apparatus itself. The colonial state had no welfarist pretensions.
None. It was created purely to extract resources and ensure law and order for the colonizers' benefit.
Since the state was an alien extractive entity, this fostered a nonchalant, sometimes hostile attitude among the populace.
The sources note this led to the conviction that nothing was wrong with stealing from it. This attitude bequeathed state-led corruption as a permanent hallmark of governance.
So political struggle became primarily about securing access to state resources for specific ethnic and social groups, detached from any commitment to the general populace.
Precisely.
Fast forward to independence on October 1st, 1960. The material is brutally honest. This was largely a change of guards.
It was. The new African leaders simply inherited the colonial state apparatus, retaining its centralized, extractive, and non-welfarist character.
And the immediate consequence was the failure of the First Republic, mired in ethnic and regionally based power politics, violence, corruption, and mismanagement.
Which led to the first military coup, initiating a long cycle of military intervention that deeply militarized society.
What exactly does that militarist culture entail? What does that look like?
It reflects intolerance and impatience toward dissent. The military structure is based on command and obedience, not negotiation and compromise.
And this culture persists today in the behavior of many elected civilian officials.
It does. It manifests as authoritarianism, a total disregard of civil rights, and the absence of due process in governance. Civilian leaders govern with a military mindset, treating political opposition as treason and public resources as spoils of war.
This inherent instability and structural flaw brings us directly to the core of the dilemma, the contentious issues of citizenship. And the most volatile, persistent issue is statism or indigeneity.
Statism is a fundamental constitutional anomaly. It is a discriminatory practice where Nigerian citizens are segregated into indigenes and non-indigenes across the various states, regardless of how long they or their families have lived and contributed there.
And this practice fundamentally undermines national loyalty.
Completely. It prevents millions of citizens, even taxpayers and permanent residents, from enjoying full constitutional rights in the states where they reside.
Give us a concrete example of how this affects the average person.
A non-indigene, even if born and raised in a state and fluent in the local language, can be denied employment in the state civil service, refused access to state university scholarships, or barred from owning certain categories of land or housing designated for indigenes.
So it basically turns citizens into second-class residents within their own country.
That's exactly what it does. It strengthens parochial orientations over genuine national integration.
The sources also point to the challenge of religion. Religious fundamentalism, citing the Islamic concept of ummah, can sometimes subordinate national identity, connecting rights and duties primarily to religious affiliation.
And this challenges national cohesion and sometimes leads to overt discrimination against non-Muslims, fracturing national loyalty even further.
The entire issue of loyalty and patriotism seems precarious because of this historical evolution. The Constitutional Drafting Committee tried to mandate that loyalty to the nation shall override sectional loyalties, but that's a tough sell.
It is because of the structural trauma of the 1914 amalgamation.
You mentioned the source calling the amalgamation a complete fraud. Why does that historical perception jeopardize patriotism today?
It's because the amalgamation was perceived as serving British economic interests and, crucially, granted a permanent demographic majority to one region in the north.
Which immediately fueled fears among Southern groups that they would be perpetually marginalized in the competition for power and resources.
Yes. If the state's very foundation is seen as serving external or sectional interests, genuine, disinterested patriotism becomes incredibly difficult to sustain.
That deep structural dilemma manifests in the final major flashpoint, the persistent issue of revenue allocation.
This is a constant bitter conflict over the control and sharing of national resources, predominantly oil wealth, dating back to the colonial era. The principles intended to guide distribution derivation, population, balanced development have been consistently distorted, especially during periods of military rule.
And the tangible outcome of this distortion is felt most acutely in the oil-producing regions.
Absolutely. Despite the current constitutional provision for a 13% derivation fund, meaning 13% of the oil revenue returns to the producing states, the sources confirm there remains a profound dearth of development in the oil-producing areas, leading to constant agitation and a sense of deep injustice.
So the centralized structure of revenue control fundamentally contradicts the local cost of resource extraction and environmental damage.
Yes, and that's a source of immense conflict.
Let's synthesize this into state-society relations. Society is the sum of all social organizations, ethnic, religious, economic interacting within state boundaries. The dichotomy you mentioned earlier between the imported state structure and the indigenous social morality is key here.
Right. Colonialism created the modern state externally. It was imposed, centralized, and extractive. Consequently, it was devoid of the fundamental moral order that was retained and valued at the community level of society.
This resulted in a dichotomized public realm. People operate with two sets of moral rules.
Exactly. One, strict accountability and loyalty to their local community, ethnic group, or kinship ties. And two, a nonchalant or predatory approach to the national state, where loyalty emphasizes duties to fellow ethnics rather than the national state.
In this highly fractured environment, the role of civil society becomes paramount.
It's vital. Independent institutions, civil organizations, professional bodies, media are vital checks. They contribute to democratic stability by ensuring the rule of law protects citizens, checking abuses of power, and helping to maintain a balanced, functioning pluralism where diverse interests can be articulated without resulting in violence.
And political parties are ideally seen as the major organizational means for articulating these diverse civil society interests with the state structure.
Ideally.
Having defined the flawed character of the state, we now shift to the citizen's burden, political obligation. Why should an individual citizen be compelled to obey a state that may be structurally flawed, corrupt, or even illegitimate in its origins?
That's the question. Political obligation is defined as the legal imposition of obligation on the citizen to obey the laws of the government, which is non-negotiable. For instance, paying taxes or registering for national service.
But there's a big condition, right? This obligation only holds if the government is acting justly.
That is the crucial condition. And the sources rely heavily on John Rawls's principles of fairness to justify this duty.
How does fairness bind the citizen?
Fairness is rooted in a cooperative scheme. If a community creates a mutually beneficial and just scheme-like functioning roads, public defense, or law and order, which only guarantees benefits when everyone cooperates,
Then you have to do your part.
you have to do your part. Any member who voluntarily accepts those benefits is bound by the duty of fair play to bear the burdens. You cannot be a free rider, taking the benefits of social stability without fulfilling the associated burdens, like paying taxes or obeying traffic laws.
But what if someone didn't voluntarily consent to this scheme? What about those who are simply born into it?
That's where the principles of natural duty come in. This duty is simpler and more foundational. Compliance with just institutions is a natural duty owed by every individual, irrespective of consent or any voluntary act. If the basic structure of society is reasonably just, you are bound by duty to comply with the rules that uphold it.
So if the government is reasonably just, obedience is a natural moral imperative. The sources classify these duties further into negative and positive.
Right. Negative duties are the fundamental requirements. Individuals must refrain from performing bad acts, such as non-malfeasance, doing harm, or non-malevolence. These are foundational. They precede positive duties, which enjoin individuals to perform good actions, like mutual aid and actively supporting just institutions.
This concept of justice leads us to moral constraints. How does morality inform the binding nature of law?
Morality is defined as conformity to the standards by which human action should be regulated. The sources introduce trans-individual ethics, or TIE, where morality is defined socially and materially, focusing not on individual conscience, but on the common good, social harmony, or collective justice.
So if abiding by state laws demonstrably promotes harmony, then one is morally obliged to comply.
Yes, it's the idea that the community's need to function smoothly trumps your personal inconvenience. Your moral duty isn't just about your soul, it's about maintaining the social fabric.
And this leads directly to the idea of prima facie obligation.
Right. The political obligation to obey the law is considered a prima facie moral obligation. This is a crucial concept. It means it is binding unless overridden by a stronger moral consideration.
The law is valid on its face, at first sight, until a higher duty compels you to deviate.
Exactly.
So when does that higher duty kick in? When does the moral obligation to obey the law get overridden by a stronger reason not to obey? That is the context for the ultimate act of dissent, civil disobedience.
This is a massive, highly public act of protest against government policies that violate fundamental principles of justice policies that undercut basic political rights or violate distributive justice. Mohandas Gandhi, whom the sources cite, argued that it is an inherent right of a citizen without which the citizen is less than a man.
We need to understand the four key features that separate principled civil disobedience from mere riot or self-interested crime. First, it is a protest tool.
It is not a goal in itself, but a means, specifically geared toward achieving a vital social purpose. It relies on publicizing the injustice, often through recurrent reporting and propaganda, to influence the public conscience.
Second, it is fundamentally public. It is not a covert plot designed to evade law enforcement.
Not at all. It is notified in advance, the time, the venue, the purpose, demonstrating the civic character of the protest and the legitimacy of the dissenters' concern.
Third, it must be strictly nonviolent.
This is essential, as the source materials emphasize, to appeal to the national conscience and reassure the public, consistent with the word civil. Violence invalidates the moral claim being made.
And fourth, it is conscientious and politically motivated.
It is performed from principled, deeply held convictions and is explicitly justified by political principles of justice, a shared societal conception of right and wrong, and not merely personal morality or self-interest, like refusing to pay a tax because it inconveniences your wallet.
But even with all these moral justifications, civil disobedience is still recognized as an act of law violation.
Yes, it is illegal because it explicitly contradicts a decision made by the state, which holds the legitimate political authority to define legality. The protester acknowledges this illegality and typically accepts the penalty, which fundamentally sets it apart from simple crime.
Shifting now from the citizens' duties to their entitlements. The institution of rights. Rights begin with the concept of liberty or freedom, meaning the non-constraining of one's action. Isaiah Berlin famously distinguished two types of freedom.
Negative liberty is the classic liberal concept. Freedom from interference or coercion by others, the absence of constraints. It's what the state cannot do to you.
And positive liberty
Is freedom to act. It's self-mastery, the ability to achieve rational goals.
Now, Berlin cautioned that positive liberty, if misused, could justify pernicious rule.
Yes, a tyrannical state might claim to be freeing its people by forcing them to conform to a specific ideology. But the conclusion is that meaningful freedom requires the conjunction of both.
You need negative liberty. The state not arresting you arbitrarily, conjoined with positive liberty, like the state ensuring you have the health and education to actually achieve your potential.
That's the balance the state must achieve.
Hmm.
Now, turning specifically to the Nigerian context, the sources detail how citizenship is acquired, primarily by birth and by registration.
And citizenship, when fully realized, should confer equal access to a range of resources, which Marshall's model calls entitlements.
Right. Civil rights, legal protection, social rights, welfare, education, health, political rights, voting, representation, and economic rights, use of land, permanent abode.
And these rights are justified not just because they feel good, but because they promote the public good.
They do. They develop citizens' potential, they encourage citizens to identify with and support the state, and they restrain state power from executive arbitrariness.
Finally, we must analyze the specific challenges related to gender and citizenship. The sources make the necessary academic distinction between sex biological and gender, the social construct.
And gendered citizenship is characterized by the constant struggle against deeply entrenched patriarchal and discriminatory practices that limit access to civil and political participation.
The Nigerian 1999 Constitution, despite being a modern document, is criticized for being inherently gender insensitive, reinforcing structural discrimination.
It is.
What is the most pointed constitutional shortcoming cited by the sources?
It's the unequal treatment regarding marital naturalization. The Constitution explicitly extends citizenship rights by registration to the female spouse of a Nigerian citizen, but it does not automatically grant the same right to the male spouse of a Nigerian woman.
So it's a clear legal reinforcement of the patriarchal assumption that nationality flows primarily through the male line.
Exactly. It limits the Nigerian woman's ability to confer her nationality equally.
The conclusion is powerful. Democracy cannot afford to be gender blind. There is an urgent, explicit need to strengthen the constitutional guarantee of equal citizenship and to domesticate international conventions on women's rights.
Moving into our final phase, we return to the state's obligations and how it performs. Let's briefly revisit the theories of rights. They are fundamentally traceable to the doctrines of natural rights from the 17th and 18th centuries. But history shows a more transactional origin.
The historical theory notes that subjects often earned their rights by performing special services or duties for the king forced levies, conscription, military service.
Right. This slowly transformed the relationship from a personal, arbitrary one to a public, impersonal one, where the duties conferred specific entitlements.
Claude's model helps us map the development of rights in stages.
Yes. First, securing fundamental personal liberties. Second, defining civil rights, protecting liberty and property. Third, achieving political equality, like universal suffrage. And finally, the fourth stage, which is the most challenging for developing states, introducing social and economic rights, welfare rights, placing expensive positive obligations on the state.
And here is a major controversy that defines governance systems globally. Are rights individual or collective property?
Right. Western societies traditionally insist that individual rights must limit the state. But the sources note that African and often communitarian societies argue that social convenience or the collective good should decide which rights are respected.
Which can potentially expose citizens to arbitrary state power justified in the name of national security or public interest.
It makes the individual very vulnerable when the state defines the collective good arbitrarily.
This takes us directly to the core mechanism of freedom: limitations on public authority. Public authority is the right to command and be obeyed, conceived as the principle of social unity in pursuit of the common good.
And the modern liberal state uses individual rights to limit public authority, essentially drawing a boundary around the government's power to prevent it from doing too much wrong.
But we have to stress that a limited government does not automatically guarantee its goodness.
Not at all. It might succeed in not violating civil liberties, but fail spectacularly in addressing wealth inequality or social injustice, precisely because it is restrained from interfering with private property rights.
So this inherent tension raises the conflict. Should individual rights be superior to public authority?
There are two main views. The hierarchical view argues public authority is superior because society, acting through public authority, is the source that creates the stability for individual rights to exist in the first place.
You can't have freedom without order.
Right. The equality approach seeks external standards, but often resolves in favor of public authority due to the greater functional consequences of societal stability.
We must also remember that few individual rights are truly absolute.
Very few. The prohibition against torture is a notable exception. Public authority must constantly strive to strike a balance between the rights of individuals and the legitimate concerns of the state, permitting necessary limitations during periods of war, epidemic, or declared national emergency.
Given these trade-offs, the next question is unavoidable. Which regime type best guarantees rights?
Robert Dahl's quantitative analysis is clear. The most comprehensive systems of political rights and liberties exist in democratic countries.
But the nuanced historical comparative method used by Wanlins is more revealing.
It is. He categorizes four types. Sultanistic regimes, where personal rule and arbitrary will reign supreme, guarantee rights the least. Totalitarian regimes are also extremely dangerous.
And authoritarian regimes, which allow limited political pluralism, offer only limited rights guarantee.
Right. So only the democratic regime is structurally expected to respect human rights, guaranteeing expression, information, and organization.
But the sources include a vital warning here.
A very important one. Democracy does not protect all human rights under all conditions. Social and economic rights, alongside minority rights, remain perennially threatened, often because of inherent conflicts between negative rights, freedom from state interference, and positive rights, demanding substantial state interference in welfare spending.
A democratic state protecting negative property rights might fail to provide positive healthcare rights.
That is the fundamental tension.
Finally, let's address the core of practical application: the state's responsibilities and governance.
Governance is the complex system of values, policies, and institutions by which society manages its affairs, and it is fundamentally demand-driven. The quality of governance reflects what the governed demand.
And the state's core responsibilities are defined by providing public basic goods. These fundamental benefits, national defense, good roads, health programs, law and order, are defined by two crucial features.
First, indivisibility. They cannot be shared out. National defense covers all citizens simultaneously. Second, non-excludability. If the good is available to some, it cannot be denied to others. If a major road is built, everyone benefits.
So when we look at the assessment of performance in the Nigerian context, the inputs, outcomes, and impact, the reality is alarming, particularly concerning these key public goods.
It is. Take health. The provision is far from adequate. Access to good health is considered a mirage. The budget allocation is consistently low. Nigeria allocates a maximum of 7% of its budget to health, compared to the international declaration minimum of 15%.
That's a massive gap, and it translates directly into high mortality rates and preventable disease.
It does. Then in basic education, the figures are not just embarrassing, they are actively declining. As of May 2008, the staggering figure of approximately 10 million school-aged children were documented as being out of school.
And the Universal Basic Education program intended to fix this is fundamentally hampered by endemic corruption.
Yes, including the diversion of massive funds intended for implementation. And in infrastructure, rapid economic growth, where it exists, has not matched development. The sources argue that to reverse the crippling infrastructural deficit roads, power supply Nigeria needs massive, sustained investment, estimated at around 20% of annual GDP.
And this deficit feeds directly into social instability. The failure of the state to provide infrastructure and education contributes directly to the staggering high youth unemployment figures. 64 million youths unemployed or underemployed, according to 2006 data.
The sources warn that this level of neglected human capital development sentences the country to a future of instability and potential anarchy if it's not addressed through massive investment and good governance.
And this cycle leads to our final and perhaps most pervasive problem: combating corruption.
Corruption, bribery, embezzlement, nepotism is described by the material as a persistent cancerous phenomenon, estimated to account for a massive 20% of GDP annually.
The consequence of this is clear. Irresponsible leadership means that vast public revenues, the source cites $10 trillion from the Federal Inland Revenue Service over just 12 years, are not judiciously applied for development, ending up instead in private pockets.
And this leads to a crisis of trust. Tax evasion is common because citizens fundamentally doubt that the funds they contribute will be used correctly.
So the solution, according to the sources, requires radical transparency and institutional enforcement.
Yes, the government must render detailed, transparent accounts for all tax revenues and visibly demonstrate the utilization of funds. Cash flows and balance sheets must be rigorously monitored. And crucially, agencies like the EFCC must be politically independent and empowered to prosecute corrupt officials without political bias, regardless of their rank or affiliation.
We've established that the modern state is defined by its abstract authority and monopoly on legitimate force, resting on a fundamental, if often theoretical, social contract rooted in fairness and mutual benefit. And the Nigerian state, specifically, inherited deep structural flaws from colonialism, which fostered a dichotomized loyalty where contentious issues like statism and ethnic affiliations continually supersede true national allegiance.
The relationship between the citizen and the state is a demanding duality. The citizen owes political obligation and loyalty, defined by principles of fairness and natural duty, but retains the inherent moral right to dissent via nonviolent civil disobedience when the government acts unjustly or corruptly.
And conversely, the government owes its citizens fundamental entitlements, including robust civil and political rights and a commitment to honest governance.
Particularly in providing basic public goods like education, health, and infrastructure, while actively combating systemic corruption that plagues the system.
The course material implies, through its analysis of governance, that the quality we get, democratic, responsive, honest, is fundamentally demand-driven.
Yes.
If the governed ultimately get the quality of governance that they collectively demand, this raises the ultimate actionable question for you, the citizen. In a complex system marred by historical dislocation, structural inequality, and high-stakes corruption, what specific, non-ethnic, non-sectional demand must citizens collectively make and sustain through the civic protest of civil disobedience, if necessary, to finally achieve the good government that Locke envisioned and Marx challenged?
That's the question.
Think about that single, universal, unifying demand as you go about your week. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.